Welcome everybody to the fourth session of the From the Ground Up Western Cover Crop Council Pacific Northwest Subregional Conference Series. My name is Stephen Hines. I'm an extension educator with the University of Idaho, and I'll be your host today. I would like to mention that this conference is sponsored by a grant of the Western SARE organization. So today's session is going to focus on the seed industry side of the cover crops. So to lead us off, I would like to introduce Annie Young-Mathews with NRCS in Oregon is going to start us out today. And she's going to talk about cover crop trials that were conducted in Corvallis, Oregon. Annie, welcome.
Great, thank you, Steve. So I'm going to talk today about some trials that took place over the course of 2 or 3 years at a number of different plant material centers across the country. So this is part of the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service plant materials program, and in collaboration with the Agricultural Research Service, we carried out these replicated trials of 8 different cover crops, a bunch of about 60 different varieties at almost all of the plant material centers across the country. And the idea was to look at regional adaptation of these species and varieties. So as I mentioned, there were 8 species, and I'll show you the varieties here in a second. But basically, the traits we were looking at nationally were germination and field emergence. So this was over the first 30 days after planting in the fall. Looking at winter survival, the date of first green up in the spring, flowering date, that's the 50% bloom or anthesis for the grasses. Looking at if they had any kind of pest or disease issues, and then mature plant height. Additionally, in Corvallis, so it was a 2-year trial, but Corvallis had kind of done a pilot year the year before. So we did it for 3 years, and we had a couple other traits that we were interested in looking at, and that included canopy cover assessments every 30 days. We also collected biomass at the end of the trial when the species got to 50% bloom. And then we took samples and sent them into a lab for nitrogen analysis for the legumes. So here's a quick rundown of all of the varieties that were included. So we had 6 different varieties of crimson clover, 8 varieties of red clover, 6 of hairy vetch, and 8 of Austrian winter peas. You know, I don't have a whole lot of time here, so I'm not going to go into any detail on a lot of these varieties, but the final reports are available on the website, and I can send that link to everybody to look up more information on specific varieties. So we also had 15 varieties of cereal rye, 2 black oats, 2 balansa clovers, and 12 daikon radishes. So we spent many countless hours crawling around on our hands and knees, counting little clover seedlings to see what the winter survival was, collecting biomass, taking other measurements and observations. And as I said, all of this data was summarized and put into final reports for each different plant material center. And then there's also regional reports. So we're part of the Northwest region, which also includes Washington, Idaho, and Montana. So there's kind of some summary of how the different species and varieties performed for our region. For those who might not be familiar, Corvallis is in the Willamette Valley. It's on the western side of Oregon, so it's the rainy side. We've got a Mediterranean climate, kind of mild, wet winters and dry summers, and it was actually pretty interesting. We had 3 very different years that we did these trials, so that was good for actually seeing how different varieties performed differently under some kind of stressful conditions, particularly the 2016-2017 year, where we got a lot more rain and ended up having saturated soils for extended periods. Some of the varieties didn't handle that well. So I'll talk first about what didn't work real well for us. Radishes were one of them that they they germinate great, they grow pretty quickly, but we had a lot of fungal disease, and that kind of has to do with some of the saturated soils, and then just buildup of growing brassicas in the same field for several years. You end up having a lot more disease. The other issue with them is that they don't winter kill for us, and so then they start blooming in February and March, which is great for the pollinators. They really like that. But it's not so great if you're not ready to terminate your cover crop then. And then you might have some of them going to seed, which can be a weed problem later on. So brassicas could be used in cover crops in our region, but you just have to make sure that you're sticking to at least a 3-year rotation with any other brassicas. And then we also have issues with seed production. So there's growers who are growing different brassicas for seed. And you'd make sure that you weren't allowing any of your cover crop to go to flower near those, because it could contaminate the crop. Austrian winter peas are a legume that is good for producing nitrogen. Lots of folks like it. We had issues with it not handling our saturated soils. So we have silt loam or silty clay loam soils that aren't particularly well drained, especially in late winter, early spring. If we get a lot of rain, when the peas were starting to try to grow again, they just got all sorts of disease and kind of melted. But I know that there are folks who grow them successfully in our area and really like them. That might work better with spring planting rather than the fall, or growing them on more well-drained sloping or sandy soils, and also growing them with a mix of some other kind of small grain or a grass, so they can grow up that and kind of stay off of the ground. It kind of cuts down on the disease. The other ones that didn't grow real great for us were the red clover. They were pretty slow to germinate, and then just kind of were little tiny rosettes over the winter, and the weeds came in real strong and kind of smothered them out in a lot of plots. They were kind of susceptible to slug damage because they're just a tiny little plant sitting there all by themselves over the winter. And then the other issue with them is that they're a lot later to bloom, so they didn't reach 50% bloom until mid-June to mid-July, which tends to be a lot later than most folks are wanting to terminate their cover crop and go in with their next crop. However, there's probably some little niches where they really could work, possibly with spring planting or in some kind of a mix that's going in before summer planted fall vegetable crop, something like that. All right, moving on to what really did work for us. The cool season grasses or small grains are very successful in our region. So the oats and the cereal rye were the ones included in this trial. We've also done different trials and used triticale, wheat, barley, annual ryegrass, and all of them are really great for germinating very quickly, even in pretty cool soils, and establishing really good cover pretty quickly. And so that helps with erosion control, it helps with weed suppression. Just about all the varieties are really winter hardy. We didn't have much winter kill with any of them, and they produce a lot of organic matter. One of the interesting things with the oats, we had these 2 different varieties, Cossack and Soil Saver black oats, and it turned out that in that really wet year, 2016-17, the Cossack was much more tolerant of the saturated soils than the Soil Saver, so it actually did better that year. But in the drier years, the Soil Saver was a lot more robust and better cover and better organic matter production. So that's interesting and useful information to know if you're going planting into a field that is prone to saturated soils. Then you can kind of choose the variety that might work better for you. The cereal rye, we had 15 different varieties we were looking at, and there was really a wide variety of maturity dates, of kind of growth forms, a lot of different stuff. I'll just point out one interesting thing. The Braceto hybrid and a couple of other varieties were quite a bit later maturing and more uniform and shorter statured than some of the other ones. So you can see that here, the Brasetto is on the left. So all three of these pictures were taken in early April of 2018. And you can see the Brasetto is still, maybe only a foot and a half tall and still vegetative, whereas the Renza Abruzzi in the middle there is already, sending up tillers. It's kind of maybe at boot stage, something like that. But also had a lot more variation within it. So there would be some that were already going reproductive and some that weren't quite yet. And then on the right, the FL401, that's a variety from Florida. And so it actually would go reproductive kind of like right in the middle of winter, and then was really susceptible to freeze damage or, wind, whatever. And so it was looking pretty rough by the spring. It was kind of already senescing. So that would be useful information for figuring out, if you want a later termination date, you want to make sure that you're picking a variety that's gonna that'll be maturing around the time when you want to be moving on, putting in your crop. So this is just a summary of some of the biomass that we saw for all of the varieties that were in this trial, as well as a couple others that we'd grown in other trials. And you can see there's really a wide variation. And a lot of that variation was actually year to year. So, a real cold, wet year, maybe on the annual rye, we only got 3,000 pounds per acre dry matter. And then on a good year, we'd have 6, something like that. There's definitely variation among varieties or among the cultivars as well. But you can kind of see here the grasses are going to be your big biomass producers for the most part. And then for the legumes, vetch is really probably the top producer. But then some years, the Balanza clover did really well too. So depends on the variety and just the climate that we had that year. All right, so as I mentioned, the vetches were really good for producing organic matter. They also are the top nitrogen producers. In our trial, we had 6 different varieties, and the Lana, which is actually a woolly pod vetch, it's not a hairy vetch, but it has a kind of different growth habit than some of the other hairy vetches, where it puts on a lot more growth early in the year over the winter. So it actually provides a decent amount of cover and could, provide a little bit of weed control, whatever, as well as the common vetch, which wasn't part of this trial, but that's one that we've worked with in Corvallis quite a bit and like a lot because of this early quick growth, and also because it doesn't have hard seed. So it doesn't create the sort of weed issue that hairy vetch kind of can. But that's also something that the Corvallis Plant Material Center, along with a couple other PMCs, are looking at now, working with some different university breeders on developing varieties of hairy vetch that are soft seeded, so they won't have that hard seed issue. Crimson clover is probably the most reliable, good legume that you see in a lot of cover crop mixes in Oregon and other places. It's very winter hardy. The slugs don't eat it as much as other clovers. Produces decent organic matter and nitrogen. And again, we saw there was one variety. This one is AU Sunrise. It's from Auburn University, that had a lot earlier growth and better cover over the winter. By the time you got to spring and they were flowering, it was pretty indistinguishable. All of them looked fairly similar in their cover, their biomass, their height. Balanza clover was a new one to us. There were 2 different varieties included in this trial that were both actually quite different. The Frontier is a lot more prostrate, lower growing, and blooms a lot earlier than the Fixation. So that one could be a good one for where you want low residue and you're going to terminate early. Fixation put on a lot more growth and actually had a lot more biomass and nitrogen production if you could leave it for later in the year. So that might be good for later grazing, something like that. And then just to wrap it up, I wanted to show this table with kind of average nitrogen production for a number of different legumes that we've done trials on in Corvallis. And as you can see, the hairy vetch, Lana, woolly pod vetch, and common vetch are all on the left side of the screen there. They're definitely the top producers, anywhere from, you know, over 200 to nearly 350 pounds of nitrogen per acre that we got off of those. Versus most of the clovers, you know, the crimson clover is right in there with a lot of the other clovers and favas that are closer to like 60 pounds nitrogen per acre, which is still really very decent and, you know, can be very helpful to the next crop. And then we've done some summer trials as well, and the tillage sun hemp was the top producer for warm season legume when it was irrigated. We did some non-irrigated trials and they really didn't produce much non-irrigated in our climate. But just a reminder that legumes are only going to produce nitrogen for you if you have the active nodulation, and so they definitely need to be inoculated with the appropriate rhizobium when you're planting them. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Mm-hmm.